It's 1942, right in the middle of World War II, and things are not going well for the Allies in the Atlantic Ocean. German submarines are hunting cargo ships coming from the US and Canada non-stop. These ships carry food, fuel, and weapons headed towards Britain. Britain really depended on these supplies. It's an island that can't just get what it needs by land. If these ships stop coming, the country could slowly starve. And that's exactly what Germany is trying to do. During the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats hunt these convoys across the ocean. The goal is simple: isolate Britain and force it out of the war without ever invading it. The most dangerous place for these ships is a huge stretch of ocean in the middle of the Atlantic. Planes from North America can't reach it, and planes from Britain can't reach it either. This creates a gap with no air cover at all, which sailors call the Black Pit. Inside this zone, convoys are basically on their own and completely exposed. German forces take full advantage of this. Submarines attack at night, sometimes destroying an entire convoy in one go. The Allies knew they needed a solution fast, but what they needed was almost impossible. A floating airbase in the middle of the ocean where planes can land, refuel, and take off to protect these convoys. But they were facing a big problem. Steel and aluminum were already being used to build tanks, planes, ships, and weapons. And even if they had the materials, building something that big would take years, time that the Allies did not have. That's when an unusual idea appears. It doesn't come from a military general, but from a strange, highly creative inventor, Geoffrey Pyke. And this time, his idea might have been the strangest one yet. He suggested building the aircraft carrier out of ice. What did this ice carrier look like? And if it really worked, why was the whole project suddenly abandoned? This is the story of the ice aircraft carrier and what happened to it. This is the forgotten Project Habakkuk. At first, the idea of building a ship out of ice sounded completely crazy. How could anyone possibly float an entire aircraft carrier made of frozen water across the open ocean during a war? Regular ice is brittle. It cracks under pressure, shatters if hit hard, and melts too quickly to last in the open sea. Geoffrey Pyke knew that if this ice ship was going to have any chance, he needed something stronger and entirely new. His solution was surprisingly simple and brilliant. He mixed ordinary water with wood pulp to create a composite material. The final mix was about 86% water and 14% sawdust. He called it Pykrete, after himself. The idea was that the pulp would act like tiny reinforcement fibers inside the ice, giving it strength and slowing down its melting. And when Pyke tested it, the results were unexpected. Pykrete didn't shatter like normal ice. It bent slightly under pressure before resisting, almost like concrete. It also melted much slower than regular ice. The wood fibers trapped the cold inside, acting as natural insulation. A block of Pykrete in a warm room would survive for hours. It could last long enough to be practical as a floating structure. In early 1943, during a top-secret meeting at Windsor Castle, Pyke demonstrated the material's performance in front of some of the highest-ranking officers in the British Army. Among them were Lord Mountbatten, who was then Chief of Combined Operations, and top military leaders from the United States. In the demonstration, Pyke brought in two large blocks, one of pure ice and one of Pykrete. He fired a pistol at the ice first. It shattered immediately. Then he fired at the Pykrete block. The bullet didn't go through. Instead, it bounced off the surface and nearly hit someone in the room. The story may be slightly exaggerated, but the military officers were impressed. Pyke might be onto something after all. After that test, Pykrete began to be taken seriously. Engineers started thinking about how they could use it to build a floating aircraft carrier that could sit in the middle of the Atlantic, resist torpedoes, and even carry planes. The material was a breakthrough, and it made the impossible idea of building a floating base out of ice seem, at least in theory, possible. It was finally time to design the ship. The giant aircraft carrier was part of something called Project Habakkuk. The idea was to build it at around 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. That's roughly twice as long as the Titanic and wider than a football field. Inside, there would be plenty of room for a real runway where planes could land, take off, and be stored. The weight was just as extreme. Engineers expected it to weigh around 2 million tons, far heavier than any normal aircraft carrier. To survive attacks, the walls of the ship were designed to be about 40 feet thick of reinforced Pykrete, so the ship could withstand torpedoes, bullets, and even some bombs. The structure was so tough that tests showed explosions and shells barely left serious damage. and the engineers believed large holes could be fixed by simply refreezing more pykrete into place. The top of the ship would be one long, flat runway, so planes could take off and land easily. At the front, there would be navigation equipment and anti-aircraft guns to protect against enemy planes. Inside the ship, things got even more complex. Huge spaces would be carved into the pykrete to create hangars, where planes could be stored, fixed, and kept safe. Deeper inside, there would be fuel tanks, ammo storage, and engine rooms. The ship was expected to carry about 150 planes, and a crew of up to 3,000 people. So it wasn't just a ship, it was basically a floating city, with sleeping areas, kitchens, medical rooms, and control centers built right into the ice. But there was one big problem. Even with pykrete being stronger and slower to melt than normal ice, a structure this massive would eventually melt without extra help. So engineers came up with a solution. They designed a complex cooling system that would run throughout the ship. This system used pipes that go through the pykrete, circulating cold air or refrigerant to keep the entire structure frozen. These pipes would be powered by onboard engines, meaning the ship would constantly cool itself from the inside. The more they planned it, the more it started to look possible. It was finally time to test if the design actually works. Before the Allies could even think about building a giant ice aircraft carrier, they had to prove that the whole idea actually worked in real conditions. It was one thing to test pykrete in a lab, but would it stay frozen and strong out in the open air? That was the real question. So in early 1943, the British military, working with Canadian engineers, built a small prototype in secret. The location was Patricia Lake, a quiet lake in the Canadian Rockies, far from the public, far from enemy eyes, and cold enough that nature would help them keep the ice from melting. They decided on a 1:50 scale model, much smaller than the real thing, but enough to test the concept. In practice, the prototype ended up being about 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and weighing roughly 1,000 tons once the ice was in place. The structure started with a wooden frame built right on top of the frozen lake. Workers added blocks of pykrete and packed them around refrigeration pipes that kept cool air circulating constantly through the ice. The cooling system didn't need much power either. It was run by 1-horsepower motors, about the size of a small car engine. Surprisingly, this small setup was enough to keep the ice frozen through spring and summer, even when the weather warmed up. This was a huge success. It proved that pykrete could survive outside a lab. It could exist in real conditions and remain stable. But the test also revealed something important. Even at this small scale, the project was complicated. The prototype needed insulation, piping, and constant monitoring. It wasn't something you could build and forget about it. It required effort and energy to maintain. And scaling this up from a 60-foot block on a lake to a ship over 2,000 feet long out on the open ocean was starting to look like a much bigger challenge than anyone first imagined. For a moment in 1943, as engineers watched that prototype sit solid through all weather conditions, it really did look like the world might someday see an aircraft carrier made of ice. But as the war moved on and other solutions appeared, the dream of Habakkuk soon became further from becoming a reality. Even though the early tests of pykrete and the prototype on Patricia Lake looked promising, real problems began to pile up. The first issue was cost. Ice itself might be cheap, but everything else wasn't. To make it from pykrete instead of plain ice, the plan needed huge amounts of wood pulp, lumber, and other materials. On top of that, the giant refrigeration system, the pipes, the engines, and the extra insulation all added serious cost and complexity. Early plans put the cost at a few £1,000,000, but once they added all the extra materials and steel, the price became 3 times higher than what was first predicted. What was supposed to be a clever way to save resources was starting to look very expensive. Then came the biggest surprise that completely defeated the original purpose of the project. One of the main reasons for building the ship out of ice was to save steel and other metals for the war. But as engineers worked out the real design, they discovered they needed much more steel than they first thought. The frame, internal supports, and machinery all required metal. By the time they added it all up, the amount of steel needed to build Habakkuk was almost as much or even more than what it would take to build a normal aircraft carrier. At the same time, technology was moving fast. By late 1943, new solutions started solving the original problem more easily. First, aircrafts improved. New, long-range planes, especially heavy patrol bombers like the B-24 Liberator, were being fitted with extra fuel tanks that let them fly much farther than before. That meant they could finally cover parts of the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Second, a new type of ship became popular, the escort carrier. These were smaller, cheaper aircraft carriers made of steel. They could be built quickly and sent out in large numbers to protect convoys right away. Because they could be built fast and move fast, they became a big part of the solution to the U-boat problem. And third, something even more important happened. The Allies got permission from Portugal to use airfields on the Azores, a group of islands in the mid-Atlantic. From there, planes could cover the gap that once seemed impossible to reach, and they did it quickly and cheaply compared to building the ice aircraft carrier. With these changes, the original problem of the Black Pit was basically solved. And once the problem disappeared, so did the need for Project Habakkuk. It was no longer worth the cost, time, or effort. By late 1943, after months of review, the decision finally came. Project Habakkuk was officially canceled. The massive ice carrier would never be built. All that was left of the project was the small prototype sitting on Patricia Lake in the Canadian Rockies. Without military funding or a purpose, the structure was simply abandoned. What remained was an ice block with a wooden frame. Then, nature took over. Over time, the Pykrete, even though it melted slower than pure ice, slowly melted away. What was once a secret military experiment disappeared into the water, reduced to almost nothing.